Okay, we'd be seated. So we will understand one of the jurors has something to do at noon. We'll make sure we stop at 10 till. If we don't, somebody needs to say something. Okay. So we'll give you enough time for that. And I meant to tell you this morning where we were in terms of our schedule. It looks like evidence will be done this week, and that we will be able to do closing arguments, and you guys can start deliberations. That'll either be Thursday or Friday. Now, you never know, things can be pushed back, but that's what it looks like right now. So the other thing that I wanted you to know is once you begin your deliberations, the jury's more or less in charge of the schedule, not me. You can set your own hours. You can keep coming in from 8 to 5. That's fine. If you want to work late, that's fine. If you want to work on Saturday, you can do that. Just try and work through this, your deliberations. I can't let you work on Sunday because sheriff and other people have to pay double time for that, but we can have you come in on Saturdays if you want to. I'm not saying you have to. But just be thinking about that. That's nothing you have to decide now, but I know you all have different schedules. So with that, Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Eikelenboom, we were talking about some of the things that you pointed out in your report. And it's fair to say that because of the limitations of where you were observing items, that you weren't able to utilize the full or all of the things you have available to you at your laboratory.
That's correct.
So you talked about things that could be done or further steps that could be taken.
Yes, there's of course, I said the presumptive test. If you have what we call suspicious stain, then you would like to use a presumptive test just to touch it a little bit and see if there's blood in there. With the adipocere, often there's blood in there, and then, that makes it more likely that there's something of tissue and blood and that kind of stuff in there. So that's an important test to do.
To your knowledge, after you pointed out the adipocere in a report we provided to the government, did they do any follow-up?
I'm not aware of that.
Judge, this is mischaracterizing it. An observation is different than a suggestion for an investigative step, which is what counsel was suggesting before.
I'm not meaning to split that hair. We told them about these things. And
and it's their decision what to do. So it's been pointed out. We just move on.
Understood. I'd like to put up, forget the number, 1198 again. Just a follow-up on this, sir. 16 even off. Over the break, I had an opportunity to look at your report again, and I just want to ask what your assessment of the sticky side being adhered to the shirt is. And if you don't remember writing something in your report about it, I can refresh your recollection with the report.
Yes, please do. I don't know every sentence or every conclusion.
Okay. May I approach?
You may.
Let me know. I'm not asking you to read it out loud into the record. Just if that refreshes your recollection, let me know. So does that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
May I approach?
Yes.
In thinking about and observing this piece of evidence, particularly that sticker, what sort of conclusions were you able to draw?
Yeah, when you do this type of investigations, you never know whether or not it becomes important. So you just observe and try, well, make your observations. And then, yeah, with this, what the observation was that the sticker was glued onto the fabric. And first, what I said, well, I thought it could have been that it just was there by coincidence, but now it looks like it was already there, which is kind of interesting, of course, because also if it was put on there, it's not logical, or not always logical that the piece of evidence stays there during these 2 years, because rain and watery conditions dissolve this glue type of stuff. But it was still there, so it's an observation. Remarkable observation.
Pardon me. Did you have an impression as to whether or not this was accidentally on there or something else?
So yeah, no. If you look at this, then you would say, okay, it seemed that this whole sticker was just put on there and was sticking. About the majority of the sticker was sticking towards the garment, so it looked like that it was put in there on purpose.
And did you make any assessment based on your expertise in evidence collection and analysis as to whether or not, or when the sticker would have been placed on the shirt?
Yeah, well, I said it's not likely that the sticker was just floating around. And as we see very often with crime scenes, especially with prostitutes, you have all kinds of debris lying in the forest. I'm not sure about this location. I think there was some stuff there as well. And it's completely not crime related or related to the crime. In this situation, I'm not sure what it means, but it seemed that the sticker was on there, before or during the time that Dylan was wearing the shirt. It was stuck on there, and actually, quite surprisingly, it was also there after almost 2 years.
Not accidental and put there at or around the time of death.
Yeah, that's what you would expect. If the sticker came there during, I said accidental, what we see very often on crime scenes, yeah, you wouldn't expect it to stick like this. And sometimes you still have some sticky parts, but then it's very loose. With this, I really used a pair of tweezers to put on it, and it's still, I think you can still test it if you wanted it. It's stuck there. But yeah, it was kind of a surprising finding, and that's why I mentioned it, but I'm not sure how it's related to the crime otherwise.
May I approach?
Yes.
I provided the prosecutor, or with the witness with what's previously been admitted, prosecutor 311. Mr. Eikelenboom, did you have an opportunity to look at this?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you observe any tissue present on it?
No.
And if it would refresh your recollection,
I don't remember if it was the shoe.
If you don't remember, I can refresh your recollection. Would it refresh your recollection to look at your report? Permission to approach?
Yes.
So yeah.
Did you write in your report that there was possible tissue associated with this shoe?
Yes, I said if we do this investigation, it's what we look for, suspicious staining, and that's what you do then is you do some presumptive testing or DNA testing afterwards if you want to know that. And
included in your report that was turned over to the prosecution, is that right?
Yes, this is included in there. And then, so there's suspicious, yeah, it's like the, I said, it's that type of waxy material, kind of, gluey as well. and yeah, you see some of that on the shoe. So,
Mr. Eikelenboom, I want to move your attention to another issue. As was discussed quite some time ago now, it is not surprising to find the blood of persons that live in a house, in that house. Is it also unsurprising to you that an overnight guest, that you may find small amounts of that person's blood in the house?
yes, of course, it's the type of action somebody do in the house, playing, fighting with brothers or whatever. But yeah, that's possible. And like having a bleeding nose, I have them everywhere, not only in my own house. That's good.
An overnight guest, even just a half a dozen times or so, that's someone who could still deposit blood in your professional opinion.
Yes, that's possible.
And have you ever studied, is there any research or have you come across in your expertise that children may be more likely to deposit small amounts of blood? That's tough to say. Everybody.
Oh, yeah. No, I did not really a study of peer review, I think, but on the crime scenes we did, and I said we find it in kitchens and bathrooms, and then we always have DNA of the suspect and the victims, and then with other family members very often we don't. So what happens then is that you find blood of somebody unknown to the case, and then you later get information that there are also children living there or other relatives, and then you know, okay, probably one of those. And if it's not relevant to the case, you don't type them out. If it's relevant to the case, then you could type them out for DNA, so that sometimes happens.
But suffice to say, blood in the house doesn't mean a crime occurred there, right?
No, these persons are still alive, and then, yeah, if you type them out, then you know, okay, they left a little bit of blood, and you go back to information you have of those people, and then later on, yeah, they sometimes describe that as a small injury or something.
Was there evidence of cleanup based on what you saw in the pictures at Mark Redwine's house?
No, based on the evidence, the luminescence, as you could compare to those examples we gave, though it is not extreme. It's the size is a couple of inches, most of it, and then some of it is even bigger because of the dripping effect. So based on that, yeah, you cannot conclude that there was a cleanup.
I think you mentioned flossing, but like could picking a scab or a minor cut cause the sort of blood that was observed on the front of the love seat?
Yeah, that's possible.
You also, permission to approach?
Yes.
I've provided the witness, prosecutors 198. Mr. Eikelenboom, did you have an opportunity to look at these clothes?
Yes.
And in your observation, did you see anything on those clothes that indicated the presence of blood?
No, I don't think so.
And if there had been a bludgeoning or blunt force trauma and or a dismemberment, would you expect to find blood on the clothing of a person who did a murder by bludgeoning or dismembered a body?
Yes, if the clothing was worn and you beat somebody up, then force is applied on blood, so you spatter. So it's just not one time beating, but several times, especially on the head. That some of that blood spatter will likely, not always, but likely very often, come back towards the perpetrator. And of course, if you start dismembering a body, yeah, the chance of you getting blood on you, yeah, is quite big. You have to be very careful to not get that, and especially depending on what type of tools you use. If you start using high-speed machinery, which we saw in Holland several times, it's also manual, which is very difficult. yeah, the chance that you get DNA and blood on you during dismemberment of bodies is quite big.
So Eikelenboom, in your professional judgment, would a pair of shoes worn by somebody who did a bludgeoning and dismemberment look like this or something else? And I can approach with you if you'd like to take a closer look. I've provided the witness prosecutor's Exhibit 197, Mr. Redwine's white shoes.
Yeah, I think I've reviewed the reports on the shoes and clothing of Mr. Redwine, and yeah, there's what we call the suspicious stains from colorations, and you can see a lot of negatives on here. I assume that those were locations tested. That's what the investigators normally do or often do. You take a small sample of location of interest or of suspicion, take a sample of it, and then you test it. Well, looking at the staining on the shoe, it's what we call staining, and maybe transfer. You have to be careful, but yeah, tested negative for blood, so blood sample analysis is not really of interest. And there's no spatter on it, so as described, if you really beat someone, you could expect blood spatter on shoes. We very often find those, if those were the shoes which were worn during the incident, of course. And then, yeah, you go from there, but there's not observed here.
Any evidence of dismemberment on those shoes?
I'm not sure how you would see the dismemberment. You have to be careful what type of action it caused. With dismemberment, in my experience, what you sometimes saw is bigger staining because blood is pouring out of some of the body parts. But yeah, there's no blood on the shoes, so there's no proof of him.
Okay, thank you, sir. Does the overall luminol analysis at the house of Mr. Redwine and on the clothes that you've just been looking at support the hypothesis that a bloody act of violence against Dylan Redwine occurred?
No, it does not.
Does the overall luminol analysis on Mr. Redwine's clothing support the hypothesis that he committed a bloody act of violence against Dylan Redwine?
There was no blood found on the clothing, so these clothing did not support it.
If the child was hit with a foam football, could that cause a small amount of blood that would not get on the ball?
Yes, you probably have this from your own experience. If you get hit on the nose by a ball on the nose, sometimes you feel the pain straight away, but then if you start looking, it just takes a second or maybe even longer before the blood starts dripping out. And of course, the ball is already gone if it bounces off your face. So yeah, it can take some time, and it would explain why you would not get blood on the ball if it hits your face. You would expect such DNA though.
Switching gears here, outside the house, did you observe photographs of where remains were recovered on Middle Mountain?
Yes.
When remains are discovered on a remote mountainside, is there a proper protocol to follow to make sure you're collecting all available evidence?
Yeah, I think there are several protocols. I think the FBI wrote protocols for that as well. But yeah, what we normally do is something is found, or in a situation where you find a body, you start marking off the area. You then take a step back, make a plan of approach, and then before you go to the evidence, you make a walking path where which is the least likely. So you assume that it could be a homicide. You always do that, even if you don't know the cause of death yet. You assume this could be a crime and that you have to prosecute it. So then you make a walking path. So you make a perimeter. And in this situation, that would have been rather big. And then you make a path which is the least likely that a possible perpetrator would have walked there. Then, of course, you start filming, videotaping, making pictures of the wider area, and then you're closing in on your object or body or piece of bones in these situations. And then, yeah, from there on, you start going closer and closer, and then you start doing your sampling and taking close-ups.
If some time has passed, is there a reason to excavate, and is that something you would have recommended based on what you saw, the photographs of the mountainside?
Well, yeah, and these photographs.
Just beyond the scope. This is a question for an anthropologist, Judge.
Crime scene investigation.
Pardon me?
It's crime scene investigation.
Yeah, I don't think you'd go too deep into it, but I think this is appropriate.
Yeah, so in this situation, there was, on the pictures you can see there's kind of a burrow, and where it's possible that the body was in there. So we have quite often actually that bodies are buried, and that's also a crime scene. It doesn't matter if they're on the ground or in the ground. And the approach is the same, of course. You want to preserve as much from possible perpetrators, bodies don't bury themselves. So somebody was involved there, so then you try to collect as much evidence from the outer ring towards the inner ring. You go down, and then, you very slowly excavate, like these, not architects, how you call these people? Archaeologists, sorry. Like an archaeologist, actually, and then in a forensic way. In that sense, the archaeologists, you have forensic archaeologists who slowly uncover the body and try to select as much evidence and find as much evidence as you can.
Not doing so could create a lack of evidence. Would you agree?
Yeah, of course, you always try to.
I sort of needed there. Pardon me for interrupting, but also you said the word burrow. Is what you're describing is an area between two trees?
Yes. So there's one of the pictures. I think you see a tree stump, and then there's some bush and bushy material there.
And was your understanding that some remains had been found between those two trees in that area? That they referred to it as two trees. Oh. You're referring to it as that.
Oh, sorry. Somewhere, the burrow came up, but a place to hide, which is.
I can move on. So sorry to interrupt. I'm just trying to be considerate of time here. I've got a picture of it. I think that might make it easier for you to describe it. Permission to publish People's 331.
Yes.
So is this the area that you're describing?
Yes.
Okay. Would it be appropriate, in your opinion, as a crime scene analyst, to dig around in this area with a stick as you've recovered items of evidence?
What do you mean, the sticks?
It sounds like the approach that you take would be different.
Objection. There's a lack of foundation here, and I'd renew my objection that there's been testimony from board-certified forensic anthropologist in this case, and we're about to ask him about archaeological work in the woods.
Investigator Patterson talked about how they were looking around digging with sticks in this area.
I understand that. But he did talk about it would be appropriate to have an archaeologist come and basically process the scene, and I don't think he's an expert in terms of any more in terms of archaeology or how that would work, so I'm going to sustain the objection at this point. You've got the evidence about the sticks, you've got the evidence from other forensic archaeologists, so I think that's where we're going to leave it.
Switching gears here, sir. Thank you. You also reviewed information and viewed pictures related to search of a Dodge pickup truck, you recall that?
Yes.
Was there any reliable evidence to support a hypothesis that Dylan Redwine's body was transported in the Dodge pickup?
No, there was not.
Was there any reliable evidence to support the hypothesis that Dylan Redwine's body was transported in a Chevy pickup truck?
No, I didn't see that.
Without going into anthropology, is there sufficient evidence for a crime scene investigator with expertise like you have to conclude that a violent human act caused Dylan's death?
No, not based on the The blood stains found, actually the one stain on the couch, you cannot draw that conclusion.
Thank you, sir. The prosecutor will have some questions for you.
Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
You talked a lot about things that you couldn't rule in terms of, like, for example, the blood evidence, you couldn't conclude necessarily that an injury had occurred, right?
Well, if there's blood, there's always an injury of some kind, except for certain diseases.
And you talked a little bit about how you couldn't, based on the evidence on the clothing, you couldn't say for certain or that there was some kind of dismemberment, right? You remember all those questions?
Yes.
Based on the blood evidence that you looked at in the case, you also can't rule those things out, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's start by talking just a little bit about your background. In your credentials, we talked about your pattern analysis and training and education. You recall that?
Yes.
The training and education portion of your CV goes up to about 2002 in those areas for the main trainings, right?
Sorry, for what?
For the primary trainings, like you talked about Ontario, you talked about Miami-Dade. Those are back around 2002?
Yes.
Okay. And then your work in the national lab was until about 2005, right?
That's correct.
And after that, you had your private lab.
That's correct.
So for about 15 years since then, it's been all work through your private lab?
Yes.
Okay. And you said 2011 you moved to the U.S.?
That's correct.
And when we talked, you explained to me that since you've been out in the U.S., you haven't done much with fresh crime scenes at all, right?
That's correct.
And even in your time from 2005 on with your private lab in the Netherlands, you hadn't done much with fresh crime scenes?
We did more crime scenes then.
Okay.
So we still did do crime scenes. We worked still for the prosecution, especially in the beginning of our own laboratory.
Understood.
But not as much. When I worked at the national lab, we did 80 crime scenes a year.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's
right. And that was back in before 2005?
Yes.
All right. And then when you came here, you said maybe a couple crime scenes a year, but those typically weren't fresh crime scenes, correct?
That's correct.
And most of the work you've done in the U.S. has been out of the lab, right?
Yes.
And you look at photographs of evidence, for example?
Yes.
Sometimes you yourself process items of evidence, right?
Yes.
And you yourself will advise sometimes on locations where additional testing can be done, right?
That's correct.
You've never been employed with law enforcement in the U.S., is that correct?
Employed in the sense that they hired us or employed?
No, like you've never been a law enforcement officer?
No.
And you've never worked for, like, for example, a state lab in the U.S.? Like CBI, nothing like that?
I worked with them. I've been there, but you mean that I'm employed?
Yes.
No, I was never employed.
It's been all your private lab during
Yes.
that time? Okay. And you've never testified in court in the U.S. about the application of luminol at a actual crime scene, like a residence?
No, I don't think so.
I just want to ask you about your education a little bit. You do not have a PhD, correct?
That's correct.
And you do not have a medical degree?
No.
And you do not have a master's degree?
No.
And you and your lab, you're part owner of that lab, right?
That's correct.
And you and your lab were hired here by the defendant to do work on this case, right?
The defendant, yes.
Right. And additionally, your wife is one of the owners and partners there, right?
That's correct.
And she was also hired with you, with your company, to do work in this case?
That's correct.
And between the two of you, you're hired to talk about crime scene analysis, right?
Yes.
And pattern analysis of blood?
Yes.
And your company's also hired to talk about cut marks?
Yes.
And blunt force trauma?
Yes.
So anthropology, right? These would be anthropology type disciplines.
Injuries is just medical.
Okay. And let's talk about that. You and your company were also hired to talk about medical evidence in this case?
Yes.
And that includes cause of death?
Yes.
And that includes manner of death?
Objection, and I'm going to object to things that they can do that we're not endorsing them, and it's beyond the scope.
Mr. Johnson.
Judge, their company was hired to cover just about every forensic discipline there is in this case.
So you're, all right. I think you can go into it.
So opinions on cause of death, manner and death, et cetera, those are also things your company was hired to do?
Yes. It's more the part of my wife as medical. Of course, we work together. And of course, bloodstain, pattern evidence has a lot to do with injuries. We want to know what type of injuries a victim has. That will explain also arterial gush, for instance. Yeah, it's arterial cut, then you could explain why you find a certain pattern. So yeah.
So collectively, you're covering just about every area of evidence in this case.
I wouldn't say that, maybe, but.
Do you agree with me that certifications and degrees can be important in the forensic field?
They can be.
Okay. And there are many requirements to attain these degrees, right?
Yes.
And even more requirements to obtain certifications for board certified type titles.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And you have to demonstrate a level of knowledge and skill, right?
Yes.
And people independently evaluate you so that they can ensure that you meet certain standards within the scientific community before you get a title like a board certified anthropologist or pathologist, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Neither you or your wife is a board certified forensic anthropologist.
Objection, it's irrelevant with respect to his wife. She's not testifying right now.
He's profiting from his company at which she works.
And my understanding is she's testifying next, so I guess it's okay. Or soon.
So she's better to testify about her certifications and qualifications.
I understand that. He can also testify about it, and you can ask her.
Is anyone at your company a board certified forensic anthropologist?
No.
Is anyone at your company a board certified forensic pathologist?
No.
Are you yourself board certified in any forensic disciplines?
No.
And you reviewed the reports by Dr. Diane Branson in this case?
Yes, I read all the reports.
Okay. And she said it was not responsible to opine on cause of death or manner of death from an anthropological standpoint, right?
That's possible. I don't remember what she also had and who wrote what and what kind of report.
Did you review reports by a Dr. Kurtzman?
I did, but I don't remember what he exactly said.
Okay. Do you recall if he said that opining on cause of death would be appropriate or not in this case?
I don't remember.
Okay. But you and your company are willing
This is becoming the prosecutor testifying. If he's going to ask this and set up a refreshed recollection, that's fine, but what this is something else.
Why can't he ask leading questions? This is your witness, which is kind of, I don't see that being a problem.
Because the examiner is not to testify. If there's something to back it up, then he needs to have the witness, allow the witness an opportunity to view it.
I don't see anything wrong with this line of questioning.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
On all these topics that we've talked about, everything from pattern analysis to cause of death, manner of death, your company is willing to opine on all of those issues.
Yes, it's possible.
Okay. Let's talk about your work in this case. You didn't examine all the items of evidence in this case, right?
No.
Just some of them?
Yes.
Have you ever been to the defendant's residence or inside the defendant's residence?
No.
Now, in other cases, you've tried to collect trace evidence, right?
Yes.
And you've also done cases where you've advised people where they could look for it and do additional testing.
Yes.
And in this case, you were given full access to the evidence in the case, right?
No, not full access. Normally what we do is we would like to have pieces of evidence like clothing to our lab and that we can investigate it there.
To your lab?
Yeah.
You were invited into property and evidence, and you were allowed to look at anything you wanted.
Yes.
And you were given full privacy to do that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you didn't recommend any DNA or fingerprints or new evidence in the case be tested by us, right?
I don't remember. It's not in the report, but normally there's a list of evidence which could, or investigations we can still do. But probably we did this before. I'm not sure that the report was written pretty late, I think. I don't know.
Okay. So you don't know if that's in your report or not?
No, there's no list.
It's not in your report.
No,
you agree with me?
No,
okay.
I agree with you.
Thank you. And so you, in this case, you mentioned what you were allowed to do or not allowed to do. You remember that?
Yes.
But you didn't make any formal request that the prosecution do an additional test on any of these items of evidence?
No, I don't remember that.
Okay. And you also didn't find any additional evidence yourself in examining these items, such as a fingerprint or DNA on the banana peel?
No, but that was also mainly because we were only allowed to review it, so we could not do the testing, which we would have done if we had the evidence in our hands and could do that.
But you didn't ask us to do that.
I didn't ask to do that, no.
You didn't even. You didn't even.
Your Honor, this is burden shifting, telling the government how to prove their case or what evidence should be further analyzed is not the job of the defense. This line of questioning is unfair and inappropriate.
It is appropriate because of your line of questioning, trying to show that you provided information that the prosecution should have done some more testing. So this is appropriate. That's number one. Number two, you two are talking over each other, and you're hard enough to understand, Mr. Eikelenboom, so please wait for the question and answer to be done before you start.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Eikelenboom, you're aware that defense counsel in this case was able to ask for items to be tested, such as a beer can, which we did for them. You aware of that?
No, I'm not aware that is possible. We were involved first in the case a long time ago, and what we normally do then, but it could also be a phone call or when we meet up to say, okay, these are the types of investigations we can perform for you. But yeah, that's not in the report. So,
not in the report.
No, I don't know. So I don't know what we all discussed during the first meetings.
Okay. And what's also not in the report is anything about fingerprinting or doing DNA on a banana peel, right?
No,
that's not in the report. Okay, thank you. So basically, your case review is you looked at the pictures in the case and you talked about that, all of them. Am I right? Was it all of them?
All the pictures which were provided to me, yes.
Okay. What was provided to you would have come from defense counsel, what we put into discovery to them, right?
Yes.
You never made an additional request of our office for any particular information. You worked off what they gave you.
Yeah, we worked for the defense, and they gave us the information we asked.
Okay. And so you read CBI reports as well?
Yes.
Your first report was issued on February 11th of 2020, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And did you review the materials that were provided to you carefully before you issued your opinion in the case?
Yeah, there was a lot of information, of course, and it's very difficult to cover everything which is in there. But I reviewed, yes, of course, I reviewed all of it.
Your report's your expert opinion, right?
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I stepped away. Your report is your expert opinion, correct?
Yes.
And in your expert opinion, you rely upon those materials and you review them carefully before you issue an expert opinion, right?
Yes.
Now, how long was it until Dylan's remains were found after he went missing?
Yeah, short of 2 years, I understood.
And you testified a couple of times you believe it to be 2 years that his remains, so they were recovered?
Yeah, about, but it was shorter, I understand, 1.5 years. Or...
What day did Dylan go missing?
I wouldn't know out of my head.
Okay. What day was the search warrant executed?
A couple of weeks later, I understood, I think.
2 weeks later, you believe?
That's possible.
So 7+ years later, you reviewed the parts of the case that the defense provided to you, right?
Yes.
Did you know there were 30,000 pages of discovery and nearly 500 disks in this case?
No, I didn't know. I know there was a lot to review.
Is it fair to say you only reviewed a fraction of that?
Well, we review, and of course, this review it doesn't mean that you extensively investigate everything, because that would take months and years. So I looked at every picture, and then you very quickly scan through that and say, okay, is there something which could be relevant to the case? But of course, no, I cannot review in the time which was given to us, and we went greatly over the time already. Everything in detail. And especially if you talk about 500 disks, no, I didn't see that.
So in your quick scan where you didn't look at all the details, your understanding is Dylan was out in the woods for 2 years before his remains were recovered, and it was 2 weeks before the search warrant was executed. No problem.
Objection. He was giving approximations that were pretty good for this pop quiz. So I'm going to object to the form of the question and testifying from the podium.
Well, again, you're over told, you can redirect on it. I think the jury understands the situation this witness is in and can draw their own conclusions from it, from questions from both sides. So go ahead, just go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let's talk a little bit more about the pretty good information you had going into these expert opinions. When was the fire?
Sorry?
When was the fire?
The fire?
Yes, when was the fire? When was the fire at 2343 County Road 500 in Bayfield?
I don't know about fire.
When was the certificate of occupancy at 2343 County Road 500 in Bayfield?
I would not know that.
When were the floors replaced?
Never read something about floors replacement.
When was the furniture replaced?
Never heard of that.
How many visits did Dylan actually have to that house after the fire and the new floors and the certificate of occupancy?
I would not know.
So you have an opinion as to whether his blood may be in the living room naturally, inadvertently, and you don't know how many days he's even been in that house with those floors and couches?
It would be relevant information, I think.
I think so too.
But yeah, there's a fact that there's one stain on the sheet.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that.
It stays the same, but it's a pretty small stain.
You weren't out on the crime scene during the processing, were you?
No.
You didn't see the actual luminol reaction take place, right?
No.
You'd agree with me when luminol reacts that it gets bright in some areas and then it fades out relatively quickly, right?
Yeah, as I said, the false positives fade out quicker than the positive blood because it's step. And yes, I agree.
Okay. So you don't know what stage of that reaction these photographs were taken, but you're working off photographs that are essentially a snapshot in time, right?
Not clearly. It depends on how the pictures were taken. But as I said, in order to get the luminescence, you have to keep your lens open. And that's during the luminescence. So you keep it open from the beginning. So before you make it all dark, before you apply the luminol, you put the camera in place. The moment the luminol is applied, you put your lens open and you leave it like that for depending at least several seconds most of the time to capture the luminescence.
So you'd agree with me it's a snapshot in the time of the process as the luminol fades?
Well, snapshot would indicate like what you do with a normal camera, but here we talk about seconds. So, and most of the time you cover the fading out of the luminol also. But yes, in the picture you only see the accumulation of luminol, of the luminescence. Okay. You cannot, in that sense, you could call it a snapshot. You have to videotape it in order to see it going up and down again.
You'd agree with me that to do blood pattern analysis reliably, you need a big amount of blood and blood stains to come to a pattern, right?
No, not per se a big amount. A small spatter can give you information, or 10 small spatters with very low volume can give you a lot of information about an impact, for instance. Well, so this has to be a large volume.
So let's break this down a little bit, because I think what you've testified to, in fairness, is that you can't make any definitive conclusions from the pictures that you have in this case. Is that a fair characterization of your direct examination?
So with luminol, yeah, you have to be careful. And then what I was looking for is that that's in pattern analysis. You really like to see pictures of, well, red, blood, and then the size and shape of it. And that's not present. So, yeah, you have to be very careful here with interpretation.
Right. And as you testified to in the Timothy Kennedy trial in April 29th of 2014, you need a big amount of blood stains to come to an actual pattern, correct?
Well, I'm not sure if I said that like that.
Okay. Would you agree that you have to be careful not to overdo it?
Overinterpretation is an issue with the pattern analysis, yes.
And you don't know from one blood stain if it's a pattern. You'd agree with all of that, right?
No, one blood stain. A blood stain, as I said, is the top, so then it means that all kinds of mechanisms can make a stain. If you have one transfer of a hand, then of course one stain can be, you can do an interpretation on. So you can make an installation on a stain if it has clear definitions.
You always have to be careful in determining. You don't want to overdo it and overly interpret. But we saw a very small blood stain. Those words sound familiar as your words from the Kennedy transcript.
Objection. This is improper impeachment, I guess, but I'd like to look at that if counsel is going to go any further with it, and there's a proper way to set this up under 613 and 1610-201 that has not been established.
Well, he talked about testifying in the Kennedy case. He's representing, this is a transcript from his testimony. I don't see anything wrong with this procedure.
There's got to be the date. He's got to point the person's attention to it.
Already did, Judge.
There's more crediting necessary.
I don't think he has to point the date, point out the date. Maybe, and he did, I believe, point out the date anyway, in terms of what the date of the trial was. But it's a specific. I mean, he couldn't have testified multiple times, I wouldn't think, in the trial. I think it's appropriate. So he either remembers it or he doesn't. So,
permission to look at the transcript the prosecutor is referencing.
Do you care?
No, I have a copy of the pertinent pages, and I think I have the whole thing in my binder electronically somewhere. I can give counsel the pertinent pages.
Go ahead.
And so, sir, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but you'd agree with me on the general concept and the words you used in the Kennedy case, that you have to be careful not to overdo it with pattern analysis when you just have a little bit of blood. Isn't that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. And especially with luminol, right?
Yeah, in interpretation of luminol, you have to take a step back and see what you really see there. And if there's nothing to see with the naked eye, you should not do an interpretation about the type of bloodstain pattern.
Thank you. Okay. So, and also that would be consistent with what you listened to on the agent from CBI saying that with the limited amount of information here, because the blood wasn't visible to the naked eye, that it wouldn't be responsible to give too many opinions on pattern analysis. You'd agree with that too, right?
Yeah, so the pattern is very difficult. So as said with luminol, yeah, we don't call it a pattern, but that's cleaning activity that you could make a support for a certain hypothesis of cleaning. But after that, yeah, you have to be extremely careful, and most of the time you don't see enough definition that you can come up with a pattern. We have some experience where you could still see a transfer of a hand with luminol. That's possible. And a shoe imprint on the floor, sometimes with luminol also. I wouldn't recommend it, but in carpet, sometimes you get nice results. So I wouldn't exclude it, but yeah, you have to be very careful. I completely agree with that, and I've always said that.
Thank you. And that's why your results here in looking at the photographs are for the most part, just inconclusive.
Yeah, very careful, I think.
And you'd agree that you have to be careful in trying to determine the amount of blood from luminol photos. You'd agree with that as well?
Yes.
And there are a few reasons for that, right?
Yes.
One reason is that luminol pattern is often after cleanup activity, and that's why it's not visible, right?
Yeah, so as the examples you could see, if there's nothing visible, then there's no pattern. If something becomes visible with the luminol, and then you have to be careful, okay, what do I see really here? If there's really clear definition, which very often there's not, maybe you could say something, but if there's not, yeah, then you don't know the bloodstain pattern, and you should not comment about the bloodstain pattern.
And if because there's none visible to the naked eye and it's been cleaned up, there could be less at the time that you're seeing the luminol.
Yeah, that's typically with cleaning up. There, of course, the volume of blood before cleaning was bigger than the volume after the cleaning up.
And then additionally, if water's applied to it, it can change the pattern as well.
Yes.
Let's talk about cleanup in general. So blood typically makes a stain, right, because it's red?
Yeah,
okay.
Depending on the surface, of course, like the black clothing is very difficult, and some types of carpet and the couches here were not, this brown, dark brown is always difficult to see blood, even if it's there, if it's wiped out, it's possible you don't see it with the naked eye. So.
Right, but we had multiple surfaces here, right? We had a couch,
yeah.
We had a love seat, we had a coffee table that was wood colored, and then we had a floor that was just approximately the lighter color like this table, right?
Yes.
So if I were to bleed, if I were to cut my hand by accident right here, and I were to deposit blood on this table, you'd see blood on that table, right?
On this table, yeah, I would expect that. Yeah.
And then you'd continue to see blood on that table until something happened to remove that blood because it has a dark stain to it, right?
Yeah, on that color, yes.
The most obvious reason being that it's wiped away or cleaned up, right?
Yeah, so of course with this flat surfaces, we talk about a drop of blood, but you very often see it drying, and it's very dry here, so it dries very quickly, and then it flakes off. And luminol can still pick up the blood which remains, which you don't see. But yeah, that's possible.
And additionally, if it were to dry, right, and someone were to wipe it away, the same way that you described the flaking, it could retain like a pattern, or I don't want to call it a pattern, but it could retain a shape when it's hit with the luminol, right?
Yes, it's possible.
Right. And so blood doesn't just go away on its own, though. You'd agree with me, right?
No, if it's deposited on the surface there, yeah, there's some kind of mechanism that has to remove it. Over time, it becomes darker, blacker. And what could happen is, I said, the flaking, especially in these dry climates. Yeah, but then, yeah, still you need some type of wind in the house or something new that it moves away. Otherwise, it will stick on the surface.
Right. So put simply, if there's no cleaning, then we'd see blood with the naked eye in this case.
Well, there's of course other mechanisms which could cause blood. If you have it on the floor and just somebody walks on top of it, yeah, then you also remove the stain. So there's different kinds of mechanisms which could cause it. The dogs are known to ruin crime scenes. So yeah, there's different ways. Cleaning is one of them. Yes.
But if you put a rug on top of it, you'd expect there to be blood on the rug, right?
If it's still fluid, then you get this stamp effect. Yeah, and you would expect blood on the rug.
You'd agree with me with the general statement that luminol is especially helpful in cases where a suspect has cleaned up blood, right?
Yeah.
And you noted that, I think, 3 times in your report. On page 2, you said it's especially helpful in situations of cleaning activity. On page 14, you said due to the high sensitivity of luminol, it's very suitable to show remnants of blood which are no longer visible to the naked eye, for example, by cleaning, right?
Objection asked and answered. The question was asked. There's no need to ask it 3 different ways, citing this way.
I tend to agree with that, Mr. Johnson. That's
Your Honor. And you'd agree with me that using a test like phenolphthalein can then rule out the false positives for luminol, right?
Yes, it's a proper procedure to do a more reliable presumptive test. But also the phenolphthalein has some false positives.
And there was a portion of your report which was like an informative portion, right, that explained some of these general concepts?
Yes.
And you explained that false positive reactions from luminol can be identified by using a specific blood test, like a tetra-based test, right?
Yes.
And you also said that only after a positive test like phenolphthalein, the conclusion about the possible presence of blood can be drawn, right?
Yes.
And you reviewed the CBI reports in this case, right?
Yes.
And you know that phenolphthalein was used in all the samples that were collected by CBI in this case.
Yes.
And you also know that an ABA brand Hemotrace immunoassay card was used on those samples that were collected as well, right?
Of some of them, yes. I'm not sure I could find out which one was elected, all of them. An immunoassay is more reliable than a standard presumptive test. So if it's positive with an immunoassay, then yeah, you can be more sure that at least was blood present.
You reviewed Agent Clayton's report, right?
Yes, I remember.
And you reviewed in that report that he tested various areas of phenolphthalein where indicated the ABA card brand Hemotrace immunoassay card in the blood. Several areas did reveal positive tests, but photographically documented that positive areas were collected by Agent Clayton and logged into evidence.
I remember that, yes.
That sounds right?
Yes.
So you'd agree with me that the areas of blood that we're discussing in this case were tested not just with luminol, but 3 ways on scene.
So luminol, the phenolphthalein, and then the Hemotrace.
Right.
Yeah. Seems like that.
And if that is done, then we know that it's not a false positive in all but the situation where it's either a primate's blood or a ferret's blood. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, for the Hemotrace, after the Hemotrace. That's
right.
Human specific. Because normally the blood test, like the presumptive test database, would also react with pig blood or horse blood. It just reacts with blood, so animal blood would be possible. Our immunoassays are more specific and can test for human blood alone. Yeah. I agree with that.
Would you feel comfortable agreeing that if those 3 tests are done in the field and they're all positive, that you have a high comfort level as an expert that that's in fact blood?
Yeah, the blood is present in the sample, that's sure. Of course, you have to combine the DNA results as well, and then if you get a mixture of DNA, it becomes more complicated.
Sure, and that's a whole different area to talk about, right? But as we're talking about these 5 samples that are tested 3 ways on scene, you'd agree that's a good process to use to affirm that this is in fact blood?
Yes, that's absolutely good procedure.
And as you're applying these tests, you can dilute those samples, right? For example, the luminol.
So yeah, luminol, but you can see it on the picture already, will dilute the sample. So yeah, if there was blood there, small amount, then luminol will dilute it a little bit. And depending on how much you apply, with the hand spray it's more, then yeah, you can dilute it a couple of times.
Okay.
The hematase and phenolphthalein, no dilution should take place normally if you apply that. The hematase, I'm not sure how you do the test with the phenolphthalein. I think you cut a piece of the swab. We always touch the object itself, but okay, you could lose a little bit of material there. You cut a piece of the swab, so you lose a little bit of material on the swab. If there was blood on the swab, or you can assume that if all 3 tests were positive, you lose some of that material.
Okay. And so you started to talk about how you have to then factor in whether DNA is recovered, whether there are mixtures, things like that, right?
Yes.
And in this case, you reviewed all the CBI reports?
Yes.
So you'd agree with me that of the 5 samples collected on scene that tested positive for blood, Dylan Redwine is the only person that can't be excluded from any of those 5 samples, right?
Yes.
I want to talk to you just about a few opinions in your report. In your, you had opined that blood was probably visible here, but I think your testimony cleared that fact up today, right?
Well, as I said before, yeah, I always look, and that of course is more difficult from pictures, especially if you don't see them. But as I explained, like with the table, you would expect to see blood. If you don't see it, then some way this blood was cleaned or stepped away. But like the couch, I know from experience in the darker wood that it's very difficult to sometimes see blood, even if it's still there, and then you only find it with luminol, unfortunately, and then you hope that after that you can still make a picture of the shape, the size of the bloodstain. But in this case, yeah, I didn't find any good pictures of the size and shape of the bloodstains, which were made visible with luminol.
Right. So all this is to say you agree that this is an appropriate situation to use luminol?
Yes.
Okay. And then additionally, you talked a little bit about different types of sprayers, and you said a high-pressure sprayer at some point, paint sprayer?
Yeah, paint sprayer, professional paint sprayer.
But you know that CBI still uses, even to this day, the same spray bottle with the fine mist because it's nice and gentle when they process?
Yeah, obviously they do that, yeah.
So you talked a little bit about your opinion of whether there was evidence to support a violent occurrence in the living room. You remember all that?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that you can't rule that in or rule that out based on the evidence you saw in this case?
No, you cannot. Yeah, there's very little blood, so you cannot. There could be all kinds of violence, and some of the violence you don't have much blood. The shooting incidents, if people wear clothing, very often give very little blood. Blunt force, therefore, actually, of course, stabbings and especially beating on the head very often give a lot of blood.
But so, let's break this down a little bit.
Yes.
There are all kinds of head injuries. Would you agree with me on that?
In common. In this case, or in all?
No, just generally speaking.
Oh, generally, yes. Yes.
There are different types of head injuries.
Yes.
Some of them are fractured skulls.
Yes.
Some of them the skin doesn't even break.
Yes, that's possible.
And some of them there are subdural hematomas that can be fatal, and there's not even an injury on the exterior.
Yes, that's possible.
It's a brain injury.
Yeah.
So there's also other ways that people can be killed with very little blood, such as strangulations, things like that.
Yes, you see that quite often as well.
But you're not a doctor, and would you agree with me you don't have an opinion as to exactly what occurred on that living room based on a few luminol photographs?
I'm not a doctor, no. No, and then of course, the small amount of blood does not leave much room for interpretation of what really happened there.
Okay. And we saw some photographs that you used as demonstratives, and they had large amounts of luminol, right?
Yeah.
You talked about some of those. One of them, the person was tortured and dragged through the house after they were tortured. Is that the one with the chair?
Yeah.
That's a particularly bloody and violent case. Would you agree?
Yeah. The person died and had a lot of injuries.
And you talked about a decapitation in one of them inside the residence that had that blood. Is that right?
Yes.
But if somebody, and counsel asked you a few questions about dismemberment, right?
Mm-hmm.
If dismemberment occurs long after the heart has stopped beating because the body's dead, you're not going to have that type of bleeding, are you?
Yeah, it depends, of course. Of course, what is important is if the heart's still beating, then you get if you get an artery or just a vein, people start bleeding as like you do if you cut yourself. Somebody's dead, that doesn't happen anymore. You don't have circulation. But of course, as long as the body didn't completely decompose and the blood is still fluid in the body, which stays for several days at least, depending on all kinds of circumstances. So then you still, if you're cutting a body up, you still will have this blood coming out of there. But of course, it's not as active as if I cut an artery in the head or in the throat. So now you're more getting a different type of pattern flowing of blood out of the body. You still use a chainsaw or something like that on the body, then you will still create a lot of pattern.
Let's take a step back. I don't think we need to talk about chainsaws.
Okay.
But what I want to ask you about is to comment on whether the amount of blood in the living room has anything to do with a dismemberment assumes the fact that the dismemberment would have occurred in the living room with that same clothing, right? It assumes that fact.
Yes, if you can sometimes test an hypothesis and say, okay, well, what would you expect on certain? Bloodstain are reproducible and predictable, so you could, in some circumstances, test an hypothesis what you would expect to find if I beat somebody 10 times on the head. I would expect a spatter. So if it's not there, then you say, well, there's no support for the hypothesis. But the other possibility is that it just didn't take place there.
Right.
So you have to be careful.
Right. Let's just use one example. Could have been a single blow to the head that was fatal, that didn't cause a whole lot of bleeding, or it did and it was cleaned up. And that body could have been moved and it could have been altered at a later date out in the woods somewhere. That would be a very different hypothesis.
Yes. And that, of course, under those conditions, you wouldn't expect blood in the living room.
Now, let's talk about the banana peel a little bit. There was a lot of back and forth about what it meant or didn't mean. In terms of the banana peel, you didn't try to fingerprint it or anything like that?
No, we were not allowed to take samples or to touch it, actually. So we just reviewed it and said, okay, it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure how it's related to the case.
In your opinion, and you didn't convey to the prosecution or anyone that idea up until now, basically, right? Is that fair?
Objection, it's in the report.
Fingerprinting's not in the report, Judge.
You know what? I'm going to sustain the objection.
I'll move on. So you had a few observations about it, right? That it likely didn't hold on for 7 months, right? It was one of your observations in the interview we did on page 2.
No, the judge said here it was special to observe because we see this often. When I looked at the picture, I thought, well, it's just something which could have come on the crime scene later or was on the crime scene and got tangled up with it. But when we tested it, it was still sticky. And that's the thing, and as I tried to explain as well, that even after, don't mention 2 years, but the time, 1.5 years between that the victim was found, it's not normal that sticky side still will stick because all the rain and all the weather conditions, but it did. So it's a given that it was there. And what you want to make more of that? It's a finding.
Why is it a given that it was on there?
Well, it's still on there.
Yeah.
So and then Then the question, of course, is okay. When was it put on there?
Well, and you reviewed the evidence, and in conjunction with reviewing the evidence, you reviewed the evidence logs too, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you know that there were searches going on for days out there?
Yes.
And you know that searchers were eating food out in the field, right?
Probably. I don't remember that it was described.
Well, do you remember that there was a banana peel packaged with the clothing scraps?
Yeah, the banana peel, I've seen that, yeah.
Okay. It's a heck of a coincidence, isn't it?
So what's the question?
The question is, you presupposed that it held on there for 7 months, but in fact, that scrap of clothing was collected with multiple items, including a banana peel.
Yeah, but still, at some point, but it has to be put on the clothing, or it had to become on the clothing. And of course, if you would, if it was stuck on the banana peel, then you would expect it to stuck on there. Why would it transfer to the clothing? So it looked like that it was put there on purpose, or maybe he did it himself. I don't know why it was there, but yeah, it was there and it was still sticking. That's actually mainly the main point I wanted to make, I think.
Well, okay, but in June 3rd of 2021, you did an interview with myself and Investigator Heidel was there, right?
Yes.
In that interview, you said, regarding the banana peel and banana sticker that was mentioned in the report, you were not sure of the significance in the case and described it as just an observation, right?
Yes. Yes.
And you questioned whether the adhesive would hold the sticker to the shirt would still be viable after it had been out in that environment until it was recovered, right?
Asked and answered.
He's talking about the report, so I think it's okay.
You agree with that statement?
Yes, I probably, as I said here, it was the expectation that after 2 years you wouldn't expect anything to stick anymore, but it did. So the expectation can be wrong sometimes, and that's what in this case is, because it stuck and it seems that it was there
or you could
quite a long time.
Or you could be right that it wasn't stuck on there for 7 months, based on some of the information we just talked about. Let's talk about, counsel asked you about some of the items of evidence you looked at, right?
Yes.
He didn't ask you about the earbuds, but when you looked at those, you said the cable seemed cut, right?
That's correct.
That would involve human involvement, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. If you talk about cutting, of course, then it's like with a knife or something. But of course, there's also a lot of rodent activity here, and teeth and the claws can be very sharp. So you can cut something with a sharp claw as well. So it's just sharp. It seems to be, and that's also not my field of expertise, that it seems to be cut with something sharp.
You didn't talk about animal claws in the report, though, right? You just said cut.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned in your report, one of your expert opinions is that a small amount of blood samples, as in 2.1 on the love seat, gives indication on single source DNA, which supports the hypothesis of blood loss by Dylan. You recall that?
Yes.
Are you aware that the defendant gave a statement to the FBI in this case?
I have seen statements of the defendant, but I'm not sure where you're referring to.
Is your hypothesis of the...
That's beyond the scope. So I'm going to move to strike and object to any further questions along this line. We asked these experts to look at the laboratory information and other crime scene investigations. So interviews were beyond the purview of direct examination and what you requested.
I'll ask you a different question, Your Honor. All right. So when you say the hypothesis of blood loss by Dylan, is that based on a statement by the defendant to the FBI, the hypothesis that you're commenting on as expert opinion?
That's the same.
So, Judge, he's issued an expert opinion in contemplating a hypothesis, and I just want to ask him, because counsel asked quite a bit about the small blood samples and single source, et cetera.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection.
So when you say the hypothesis, you mean the defendant's hypothesis. Am I accurate about that?
No.
Yeah. He wouldn't know that Mr. Redwine's hypothesis.
Well, he just said no, so that's not your hypothesis. So
What is the hypothesis? When you say, let me just ask you directly then. When you say a small amount of blood samples as 2.1 gives indication on a single source of DNA, which supports hypothesis of blood loss by Dylan, Is that hypothesis that there was never any injury to Dylan? Is that hypothesis that there was a bloody lip sore? Or is that hypothesis that a Nerf football caused a bleeding injury that accounts for all this blood? Which hypothesis is that?
No, the hypothesis is you're talking about activity level hypothesis. First, when you do the investigation, you go to the source level. Is it blood? Well, that was proven by very accurately by CBI and the FBI, I think. And then you go, okay, which is source? That's the DNA part. And then I think that's the point I want to make there is that there's support that Dylan donated his blood to the sample. So we're in DNA level now. First we prepare blood, then we determine, okay, who is it from? This is blood of Dylan. So there's strong support that Dylan donated, strong support for the hypothesis that Dylan donated blood on this chair. So the hypothesis is we wanted to know, okay, source of blood and well, is it blood? So and then you come up to the hypothesis, not the hypothesis of how it was distributed, but the hypothesis that it is blood of Dylan. It's very important at the source level. It does not test how it did get there.
So you'd agree with me, sir? I just want to ask you one more line of questioning. So we talked a little bit about mixtures in the room, right?
Yes.
And we just talked about single source. But let me put up 116. Now, when you see this type of blood or reaction from luminol, you said in the past that if it was on a rug that you can almost always find it, right?
Yeah, rugs are extremely difficult to clean.
And you're aware in this case, the rug didn't have any blood on it when luminol was applied to it, right?
Yeah, the rug was tested negative, I understood.
So you'd agree with me that someone put a rug over that blood? You'd agree with me because there's no blood on the rug that someone put a rug over that portion of blood?
Yeah, so if the blood is dry and you put a rug on top of that, then of course the dry blood can cause some luminescence, but if it's concentrated, that's difficult sometimes to see. But yeah, the fluid blood is what will react with luminol the best, if it was fluid and then dry. So yeah, it's possible that you put a rug on top of dry blood because you put it there much later, and that you don't find a positive reaction. Yes, that's possible.
So when we talk about DNA mixtures, you'd agree with me that with no other information, you can't tell which person contributed blood to the mixture and which person could have contributed something else to the mixture, right?
Yes, if you don't have other information, that's the problem with the mixtures. You always want to get more context, and of course, DNA scientists very often don't have that. There's one thing with blood stains, if you have a real major donor and a minor, blood is a very good source of DNA.
So I want to stop you only because you've been limited to sort of crime scene, right? But I do want to ask you, because you made an important point, right? Context is important.
Yes.
And so if you knew, let's hypothetically say you knew that was a mixture of two people, and one of those people could definitively tell you that they hadn't bled in that location, that context information would tell you that blood came from the other person, right?
Objection, that's a mischaracterization of
the hypothetical
testimony. Well,
Right. It's been a long time, and I'm sorry I don't remember where some people said they did or did not bleed.
I remember, Judge.
I'm sure you do.
As do I.
It was stated by Corey Redwine that he did not bleed there, but I was just going to do a hypothetical to point out the context and how conclusions can be drawn.
He did testify that he did bleed at the house.
Well, the jury can remember whichever one he did testify to in their collective memory, and you can ask the hypothetical with that understanding.
Thank you, Your Honor. So if you had a mixture of two, let's just assume hypothetically, and you were able to determine that one of those people had not bled there, then with that type of context information, you could make a better conclusion as to whose blood it was.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you, sir.
You have 6 minutes, or else I have to come back, so whatever you want to do.
I'm going to give it a shot, Your Honor.
Okay.
Please keep up People's Exhibit 167. This, to me, looks like it's in front of the love seat. And there was swab taken there that did not indicate the presence of blood. Is that consistent with information that you have reviewed?
Yes. Yeah.
Would it help to take a look at this picture, and you can compare the picture that says that there is a DNA profile from this spot that is not blood, that is Dylan and Corey? Would it help to take a look at a picture so you can?
Yes, that's what I remember of that picture.
I see what counsel's approaching.
Yes.
Is this 340? Let me show you the real one.
Based on the way the floor was fluorescing there, is it your impression, based on your expertise, that that was probably blood, or at least iron oxidizing and luminescent?
Now, with luminol, if it fluoresces, at least you have an indication that there is some type of metal holding paint or some other issue type of material there. So there's fluorescence, and then you investigate it with the presumptive test. And if the presumptive tests are positive, then there's support for the hypothesis that it is blood.
There are three things there: blood, DNA of Corey, and DNA of Dylan. Can you say who bled there?
No, not based on the information I've got.
Commissioner approach.
Yes.
I'm going to object to beyond the scope and irrelevant.
I don't know what it is, so I don't know that I can respond. Mr. Moran?
Are the certifications for his laboratory? He was questioned about whether he was certified, board certified, but he was also questioned about whether his certifications were accurate, up to date, and they clearly are based on these exhibits.
He wasn't asked if his lab was certified. He was asked if he had certification in what he was testifying about, and so I find it to be irrelevant.
These are certificates of accreditation that
That's inappropriate.
What you stated. So,
which is part of the work he does.
Right, but that's not what he was asked. That's not what he did, and so I'm sustaining the objection.
Mr. Eikelenboom, based on what you have reviewed, do you have any reason to believe that Colorado Bureau of Investigation crime investigator Joe Clayton reviewed all 30,000 pages of discovery?
I don't think so.
In any of his reports, he mentioned that he had looked at all 500 pages of, or all 500 discs in this case to reach his conclusions?
Objection.
That's unfair. That's unfair based upon the situation that both of these witnesses were in. And what was testified to by both witnesses, so you cannot ask that.
Okay, understood. There were questions to you about a certificate of occupancy that was issued sometime in 2010 or 2011. How many trips of Dylan Redwine to that house would have been necessary for the blood and the amount found here, specifically that blood on the love seat that is Dylan? Would he have had to visit many times or once?
Just one incident, of course, can cause this. If you get a bleeding injury to your hand or your face, wipe your nose and wipe it there. Yeah, it's not that much. So yeah, one incident is enough.
We're looking at the FBI evidence response team casebook, refresh your recollection as to what date it was that they did their search.
Yeah, about the crime
Search that you were asked about that happened on November 29, 2012. You thought it was a week or 2 weeks later. Would you agree that November 29, 2012 sounds all right?
Yeah, I think so.
I can show you the report if that would help refresh your recollection about the report you read a while ago.
Yeah.
There were some questions to you about a Timothy Kennedy case that happened in 1995. Do you remember testifying in that case?
Yes.
And that was a case about high velocity impact spatter and possible gunshot evidence?
Yes, it was a double homicide of a man and a girl, and yeah, there was a lot of blood there.
So very different than what we're talking about in this one.
Yes.
There were questions to you about whether you've ever worked for law enforcement, and it ultimately was resolved that you've never had a W-2 or paycheck from law enforcement. But have you consulted with law enforcement?
Yes.
Have you studied with law enforcement?
Yes.
Have you taught law enforcement?
Yes.
Have you helped law enforcement solve cases?
Yes.
When you worked as a crime scene investigator and analyst in the Netherlands, did the Netherlands have an interest similar to how we do in the United States of America in solving crime?
Objection beyond the scope. And it's also been covered already.
This part, I think, this last part, I'm going to agree with. I mean, he's already testified that that's what he did for the courts in solving crimes, so I think it's been covered. Do you have any more? Because we're at our hard stop.
All right, I'm going to have to bring him back for a few minutes.
All right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to come back. I'm sorry. Hang on just a second, please. Please don't discuss this case amongst yourselves or with anyone else during the course of the trial. Don't initiate, post, and respond anything about social media Just keep an open mind. Don't talk to anybody about the case, and don't gather any information on your own. We will start up again at 12:30. I know that's longer than normal, but excuse me, that's shorter than normal. How about 1:30? Make sure that our juror can do what she needs to do and still get something to eat. All right. Everybody, agree?